Hello everyone, we have on this side. So today hand we are starting with a topic called as central neural system or what we call as central nervous system. Okay, so let's get started. Here, our brain is the central information processing organ. Our brain is the central information processing organ of our body, and it acts as command and the control system. So basically I'm writing something, let's say I'm writing central, correct? So basically my brain is commanding my fingers to write central. So that is the reason why our brain is called as a command and the control system. Okay, deal with it. Basically controls the voluntary movement which are under our will, which means if we want, then we can go for the movement, and the balance of the body as well. This balance of the body is basically regulated by the cerebellum, okay, the second largest portion of the brain, functioning of the vital involuntary organs as well. Okay, vital involuntary organs which are situated in the thoracic cavity. For example, the lungs, heart, kidney. Thoracic and the pelvic cavity, lungs, heart and the kidney. Okay, deal with these are basically involuntary. We can't ask our heart to stop beating or the kidneys to stop filtration or like rather the lungs to stop respiration. We can't, and that is the reason why they are called as involuntary organ, which means they are not under our will. The thermoregulation. Basically, this thermoregulation is the maintenance of a constant body temperature. Correct? What is the normal body temperature of human being? It is 37 degrees C. Okay? Do remember the case. Hungers and thirst as well. Hunger and the thirst as well. Now, the another case is called as the circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm here. So basically this circadian rhythm is also called as biological clock. Okay, circadian rhythm is also called as biological clock. Please do remember one case that I've already made a complete video on biological clock explaining each and every possible detail of this. Okay, so you can refer to that video as well. But still for the time being, the gland which is responsible for the circadian rhythm is called as pineal gland. It is called as pineal gland, and the hormone is called as melatonin. Okay, deal with. So the circadian rhythms are as well, and the activities of the several endocrine glands. For example, the pituitary gland, thyroid gland, even like the another different glands. Okay, so they are under the control of the central nervous system. And the last but not the least one, the most important one is called as the human behavior. Human behavior, the way we are talking, the way we are walking, the way we are behaving with the fellow humans is just because how our central nervous system is working. Okay, now our brain is also the site for the processing of vision, of hearing, speech, memory, intelligence, emotion and thoughts. Do remember one case that there is a special area in our brain is called as responsible for the speech center called as Broca's area. Okay, it's called as Broca's area, responsible for the speech center. Now our human brain is well protected by the skull. Yes, that is also called as a brain box. Okay, deal with. Inside the skull, the brain is covered by the cranial meninges. Inside the skull, the brain is covered by the cranial meninges, further to avoid damage to the brain. It is consisting of three different layers. The outermost is called as dura mater, then the middle one is called as arachnoid, and the last but not the least one, which is in direct contact with the brain, is called as the pia mater. So you can remember a word called as DAP. Okay, you can literally remember the word called as DAP. D stands for the dura mater, A stands for the arachnoid, and P stands for the pia mater. Basically the dura mater is the outermost layer which is very dense and thick. Then the middle layer is very thin called as arachnoid. Okay, and the last layer which is called as the most innermost layer called as the pia mater, which is in contact with the brain tissue, which is in contact with the brain tissue. Now the brain can be divided into three major portions, that is called as the forebrain, midbrain and the hindbrain. Now we will be dealing with the diagram of these. Okay, so here we have the all the three portions of the brain, that is called the forebrain, midbrain and the hindbrain. So the first thing first is called as the cerebrum, and the second is called as the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Do remember one case that this portion is called as the thalamus, and then This portion is called as the hypothalamus. Correct? Okay. So cerebrum, thalamus and the hypothalamus are combinedly making the major portion of the first portion of the brain is called as forebrain. Then we can literally go for the second portion, that is called the midbrain. This portion is the midbrain here. Correct? Okay. This is not further divided into any portions. And the hindbrain does have pons, cerebellum and the medulla. This is pons, this is cerebellum and this one is the medulla. Okay, deal with that is also called as brain stem. That is also called as brain stem. Here you can observe here in this case. Okay, brain stem is basically made up of midbrain, a small portion of the midbrain and hindbrain, and that they will be continuing into the spinal cord. Here we have another words as well, that's called as a cerebral aqueduct here, which is present here, right, like directly. And the corpus callosum is also here. This one is like the corpus callosum, which is the connection between the two cerebral hemisphere. If I'm drawing brain in this direction, there is a like a median fissure here. Okay, so our brain is basically divided into two cerebral hemisphere. They are called as a right on the left. This one will be the left for you and this will be right. So this is the right and the left, and there's a connection between the right hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere, and that is called as a corpus callosum. Okay, deal with. So we are done with the diagrammatic portion. Now dealing with the forebrain. So basically we already know that the forebrain consists of the cerebrum, thalamus and the hypothalamus. Cerebrum, thalamus and the hypothalamus. So here the cerebrum forms the major part of the human brain. We already know that the more than 80% of the human brain is consisting of cerebrum only, and a deep cleft is there which is dividing the cerebrum longitudinally into two halves, something like this. Okay, into two halves, which are termed as the left and the right cerebral hemisphere. Okay, and again the cerebral hemisphere are connected by a tract of nerve fiber. If you are preparing for a competitive exam, do remember one case, that the left and the right cerebral hemisphere are connected by a tract of nerve fiber. They are called as a corpus callosum. It's called as corpus callosum. Now, one more extra thing, that the layer of the cell which cover the cerebral hemisphere is called as the cerebral cortex. Do remember one thing, whenever we are observing any type of organ, that organ's outer portion will be cortex and the inner portion will be medulla. By means of any different organ, even in the plant portions as well, plant parts as well, you can divide the cortical region and the medullary regions. Okay. Now, so the cerebral cortex is thrown into prominent folds. Yes, we do observe prominent folds on the brain, and there's a myth like which says that the highest number of the folds you have, the more talented you are. The gyri and the sulci. The cerebral cortex is referred to as a gray matter. Why we are calling it as gray matter? Because the grayish appearance. And how come the grayish appearance has come? So it is because of the cytone aggregation in the cortical portion of the brain. Cytone, or rather we'll call it as the cell bodies, are concentrated here, giving the color, the grayish color. Do remember one thing, that there are two portions, the cytone and the axon in the nerve. So the place of the brain at which the cytones are aggregated, that place will be called as a gray matter, whereas the place where the axons are present, that will be called as a white matter. So the brain is having gray matter in its cortex region, whereas the spinal cord is having its gray matter in the medullary region. Do remember, please do remember this difference. Now the neuron cell bodies are constant. Now here the cerebral the, the the cerebral cortex contain motor areas. Correct, the cerebral cortex contains motor areas and sensory areas as well, and there are some regions in the cerebral cortex which are neither clearly sensory nor motor in function. So what we'll be calling them as the mixed one. We'll be calling them as the mixed one for just our understanding. Okay, because they are not doing exactly like the motors function, not even the sensories function. And this region will be called as, properly they will be called as association areas. Association areas which are responsible for the complex function. What does this complex function means? So basically the complex function means the intersensory association. It means the intersensory association. Okay, deal with. Now here if I'm dealing with the intersensory association, and the other region is as well like the memory and the communication and something like that. So we do have a memory chip there in our brain as well. Okay, and we do have a special place that is called as a communication center as well, what we call as a Broca's area. the speech center. Do remember the case. The fibers of the tract are covered with the myelin sheath. Yes, we have already dealt about the myelin sheath, right? Okay, so the fibers of the tract are covered with the myelin sheath, which constitute the inner portion of the cerebral hemisphere. So the inner portion of the cerebral hemisphere is myelinated, correct? The tract which are present are myelinated, and they give an opaque white appearance. Yes, that will be called as white matter. So the outer portion of the cerebral hemisphere is gray because the cytons are aggregated, and the inner portion is white because like the axons are aggregated, and here the axons are myelinated. That is the reason why we are having opaque white color. Okay. Now here the cerebrum wraps around a structure called as thalamus, which is a major coordinating center for sensory and motor signaling. So the thalamus is responsible for the sensory and the motor signaling. And one of the most important part of the brain, is called as hypothalamus. Okay. What does the hypothalamus function? Basically, the location of the hypothalamus lies at the base of the thalamus, and the hypothalamus contains a number of centers which control body temperature, urge for eating and drinking, like the hunger and the thirst. It also contains several group of neurosecretory cells as well. We secrete the hormone called as hypothalamic hormone. Do remember one case, like the hypophysis, that is also called as pituitary gland, is under the control of hypothalamus. Okay, is under the control of hypothalamus. So somehow, like if the pituitary gland has to secrete the growth hormone, hypothalamus will be secreting growth hormone releasing hormone. Okay, deal with, then only the pituitary will be secreting growth hormone. Now the inner portion of the cerebral hemisphere and the group of associated deep structure like the amygdala and the hippocampus are also there. Do remember one case, that the amygdala is responsible for the fear center. It is responsible for the fear, correct? Whereas the hippocampus is responsible for the limbic system. Okay, deal with. They are forming the complex structure called as the limbic lobe or the limbic system. So along with the hypothalamus, they are involved in regulation of sexual behavior, expression of emotional reaction, that is excitement, pleasure, rage, and the fear, and motivation as well. So three portions are there, that is called as amygdala, hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. All of them are coming together and they are working. Then they are working for the excitement, pleasure, rage, and the fear and motivation. So see, if I'm drawing the hypothalamus here, so this portion will be called as amygdala and this portion will be called as hippocampus. Okay, go for. Now dealing with the midbrain. So basically the midbrain is located between the thalamus and the hypothalamus of the forebrain and the pons of the hindbrain. So somehow, like the last portion of the forebrain and the first portion of the hindbrain, the location will be called as the midbrain. There's a canal called as a cerebral aqueduct. There's a canal called as a cerebral aqueduct which passes through the midbrain. If you are preparing for a competitive exam, do remember one thing, that this question they may ask. What is the name of the canal which passes through the midbrain? It's called as cerebral aqueduct. Do remember the case. Now, the dorsal portion of the midbrain consists mainly four round swellings. Please, four round swellings, we can call them as lobes as well, and they have a very famous name called as corpora quadrigemina. Corpora quadrigemina. So what is the location of the corpora quadrigemina? Basically, it is present in the dorsal portion of the midbrain. And how many are there? There are four round swellings. Okay, that is the reason we are calling as a quadri. Okay, go for. Now, the last but not the least one, it is the hindbrain. So the hindbrain comprises pons, cerebellum, and medulla. Pons, cerebellum, and medulla. So dealing with the medulla is also called as medulla oblongata. So the pons consist of the fiber tract that interconnect the different region of the brain. Okay, the pons consist of fiber tracts which are interconnecting the different regions of the brain, whereas the cerebellum has a very convoluted surface in order to provide the additional space for many neurons. Okay, cerebellum does have an important role in the posture balancing and the body balancing. Okay, please remember. Now the medulla. So the medulla of the brain is the connection with the spinal cord, or rather I'll be calling it like the medulla is a connecting link between the brain and the spinal cord. It does contains the center which is responsible for controlling respiration, cardiovascular reflexes, and the gastric secretion. Okay, respiration, cardiovascular reflexes, and the gastric secretions are controlled by medulla oblongata. Okay, I've already told you about the brain stem as well. Look, the brain stem, there are three major regions which are making the brain stem. That is called as the small little portion of the midbrain, then the pons and the medulla oblongata. Combinedly, these three portions are forming the they are forming the brain stem. Midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. There's no relation of the cerebellum here, and the brain stem is forming the connection between the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, hopefully this lecture has been beneficial for you guys. Thank you very much for your so much support. Thank you.